Now that we have seen how the accounts of the flood and Noah's sons apply to the original Israelite readers, we should turn to our third focus, Moses' original intention when writing about the defeat of Babel in Genesis chapter 11, verses 1 through 9. To grasp how Moses wanted the Israelites to apply the story of Babel's defeat to their lives, we will look into three aspects of this passage. First, Moses' description of the city. Second, his description of Yahweh's victory. And third, the implications for the Israelites as they moved toward the Promised Land. Let's look first at the description of the city. We should note that the name of the city, Babel, corresponds to the city which later came to be known as Babylon. By the time of Moses, the city of Babylon was well known in the ancient Near East. It had been a center of civilization for many years, and its reputation had reached mythic proportions. So when Moses wrote about a place called Babel after the flood, his Israelite readers would have immediately recognized this place as the primeval origin of a great urban center. A second important aspect of Genesis chapter 11 verses 1 through 9 is the way in which Moses described Yahweh's victory over this great primeval city. At several points in his story, Moses displayed the grandeur of God's victory by contrasting the outlooks of the inhabitants of Babel with his own true outlook. For example, consider the way Moses handled the theme of scattering, or in Hebrew, the verb putz. On the one hand, the inhabitants of Babel were deeply concerned with the possibility that they might be scattered. In chapter 11, verse 4, we find that they built the city so that they may not be scattered over the face of the whole earth. But by contrast, Moses reported twice that God did precisely what the people of Babel did not want to happen. In chapter 11, verse 8, we read that the Lord scattered them over all the earth. And again, in chapter 11, verse 9, we find that from there the Lord scattered them over the face of the whole earth. Frequently in the Old Testament, the term scatter has the very negative connotation of utter defeat in battle. Defeated soldiers are scattered as their enemies chase them away, slaughtering them as they flee. And this is the connotation in this story as well. Moses presented this story as an account of an astonishing victory for Yahweh. Yahweh called his heavenly host to war against the city of Babel and to chase away its fleeing inhabitants across the face of the earth. Another way in which Moses contrasted his outlook with that of the inhabitants of Babel was with respect to the size of the city and its tower. According to Genesis chapter 11, verse 4, the inhabitants of Babel wanted a tower that reached to the heavens, the place of their gods. But Moses scoffed at this idea. Instead, in Genesis chapter 11, verse 5, he wrote that the Lord came down to see the city and the tower that the men were building. The Hebrew word yarad, which is here translated came down, has a rather specific connotation in this story. God did not simply notice the city. He did not even simply come to the city. Instead, whereas the inhabitants of Babel wanted to build a tower that reached to the heavens, Moses insisted that Yahweh had to come down from the heights of heaven just to see the city. So we see that Moses jeered at the pretense of the inhabitants of Babel. From Yahweh's point of view, this city was little more than a tiny speck. Finally, we should note how the defeat of Babel led Moses to deride the reputation of this primeval city. The inhabitants of the city called it Babel. In the languages of Mesopotamia, the term Babel meant the gate of God. This name expressed the belief that their ziggurat actually formed a gateway to the gods, and that they were secured by the powers of heaven. But Moses had a different viewpoint on the name of the city. Since Yahweh had severely defeated Babel, the city was clearly not the gate of God. So, what then did the name mean? Moses' strikingly sarcastic answer appears in Genesis chapter 11, verse 9. That is why it was called Babel, because there the Lord confused the language of the whole world. To understand Moses' sarcasm in this verse, we need to understand how he played with the sounds of two Hebrew words. First he said, that is why it was called Babel. The Hebrew word for Babel is simply Bavel, a Hebrew version of what the Mesopotamians called that place. But then Moses explained that the city had this name because the Lord confused human language there. The Hebrew word translated confused is balal, which sounds similar enough to Bavel in Hebrew that Moses' sarcasm worked. He reviled the ancient city by saying that the real reason it was called Babel was because of balal, or confusion, that took place there. So from Moses' point of view, the name Babel was appropriate for this place, not because it was the gate of God, but because it was a place of confusion for the whole world. Through this sarcasm, Moses utterly reversed the awesome reputation that Babel had in his day. He led the Israelites in delightful laughter as he told them that the victory of their God Yahweh had made a joke out of the greatest city of primeval history.